Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session for the Microsoft Reactor Mixed Reality BizApps 101 Dynamics 365 Remote Assist Deployment Best Practices. Thank you all for joining us today. Paige is going to get started shortly, but I wanted to make just a few quick announcements. The first one is we do have the live Q&A open. So you should see an icon that's two text boxes with a question mark over the top one. That is the live Q&A. Please feel free to ask questions as we go. Paige will be taking a few breaks in between her presentation to answer some of your questions, and then we'll also be answering some at the end. I'll also be sharing some links in the Q&A as well. I'll have a link to our Reactor meetup pages where you can see other upcoming events that we have. A link to sign up for our monthly newsletter if you want to hear about what we have coming up that way. I'll also be sharing a link to our YouTube channel where this presentation as well as other past presentations will all be posted. And finally, towards the end, I will be sharing a link to our Reactor survey with the event code for this event. If you have a few minutes and you can fill that out, we truly appreciate all of your feedback. Thank you again for joining us, and Paige, on to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm super happy to be here today to talk about mixed reality deployment. My name is Paige Winfield, and I am a mixed reality solutions architect. And let's just dive right in. So first, I would like to start with a brief agenda just to outline the flow of today. First, we'll talk about why remote assist. In that section's pretty much going to talk about why remote assist is awesome. The second one is the overview of the scenario and common customer concerns that I typically see, my deployment recommendations, and a Q&A. So why remote assist? Well, first, remote assist has a lot of great features that enable our customers to be successful. Number one, remote assist allows for hands-free troubleshooting. So you can expect to call an expert while you're on the remote assist app. You can call an expert and have free use of your hands while you are troubleshooting a scenario. Third, or the next one, remote assist allows you to annotate in your physical space as well as to invite others to annotate as well. So this comes in handy when you are servicing equipment with remote assist. And for example, an expert might tell you to do something to a particular piece of machinery or equipment, and annotation just really drives home that clarity to circle or to mark in your physical space exactly what the expert is talking about. And that works on the opposite end as well, where you have the ability to drive clarity as well as the remote assist user by annotating in your physical space. What you can also do is share documentation. So remote assist grants experts the ability to share documentation with the remote assist user. In my experience, experts are typically sharing manuals and wiring diagrams. The document will appear in the remote assist user's physical space, and the awesome thing about this is that you can also annotate on this document that's in the physical space. Something else that you can do in the context of document sharing is that the remote assist user can pull up documents and share those documents with the expert that is on the call. And again, you can annotate on these documents as well as enlarge them, make them smaller, make them bigger, and move them around. So, you know, when it pops up, you might want to move it to a different space, or you want to pin it to a different location, and you can do that. One thing that I also find amazing about remote assist is that you can capture images. So this gives the remote assist user, excuse me, the ability to capture images of their physical space to be shared with the experts. And I typically see customers use this when they want to reference something after the call. So they'll have that video or that image captured. Remote assist also gives the users the ability to record their surroundings and their sessions, which again you can use for reviewing purposes. So after the meeting ends, you can go back and review those images and those recordings for your notes and for reference. And the last thing I want to touch on is that remote assist has voice commands to further enhance the hands-free experience. We have a lot of different voice commands. I typically see customers learn a handful and then add on more voice commands as they go because we have quite an extensive list. All right, so on to the next section. So there are three main scenarios that I want to cover today, and then I will pause after each scenario, so that way the audience can ask questions. So the first one is the HoloLens 2 plus Remote Assist internal user scenario. The second one is more so an external RA user, and the third one is RA servicing. So in this example, this is a pretty straightforward in the typical use case that I see Remote Assist customers use with Remote Assist, and that's the internal HoloLens Remote Assist user. So this one, we have company X, and company X has two users. One user is on Teams or uses Teams, and one user uses Remote Assist, and they communicate with one another. The Remote Assist user might start a call with the Teams expert, typically for servicing or to help troubleshoot some type of machinery. And also, I want to note that the Teams user can initiate the call or the meeting as well. And this is usually for these are two internal employees communicating with one another. And this is probably the use case that I see the most frequently. So this is why we're going over this one as the first use case. A common concern that I get with this one is, how do I restrict the HoloLens to only display or allow certain apps? And the answer for that is Kiosk mode and WDAC. And these are two different policies that you can set in Intune or in any other MDM, such as AirWatch or Mobile Iron. And what Kiosk mode is basically it changes your user experience, or it controls the user experience. So what I mean by that is that with Kiosk mode, it grants you the ability to restrict what Remote Assist users can see when they're on the HoloLens. So for example, if you only want the Remote Assist user to access Remote Assist or Remote Assistant guides, you can do so with Kiosk mode. So maybe you don't want them to have access to the browser. I like to classify Kiosk mode as a user experience, whereas WDAC is more so a security control. WDAC is a policy that can also be set by your MDM, which allows or blocks certain apps on the HoloLens. So it restricts the apps by not removing the visibility, but completely removing the access to the app. So again, Kiosk mode is a user experience capability where it restricts what you can see, where WDAC is a security measure that restricts what you can access. And I'm going to pause here and allow a few moments for questions.
It doesn't look like we have any questions at this time.
Okay, so on to the next scenario. And this scenario is the external HoloLens Remote Assist user. So in this example, we have two companies, Company X and Company Y. Company X is a client of Company Y. Company X owns their own HoloLens device, and they own their own Remote Assist licenses. And Company Y has experts as well as a Teams license. And Company X wants to, call Company Y in order to help or to get help servicing machinery or troubleshooting a scenario or an issue that they might experience. And in this scenario, I see the scenario quite often as well. This is the second most seen scenario, or the scenario that I see the second often, or the second most often. And with that being said, there are some concerns or common concerns that I run across, and there's a few extra ones in this category. So the first one is, how does Company X and Company Y communicate with one another? Well, the first thing is to understand the difference between open federation, and guesting. So in this scenario, if both companies, company X and Y, both have open federation, which is on by default. So when you purchase Teams and you implement Teams inside of your company, open federation is on by default. So by default, most companies or most customers that I run into, they're able to communicate pretty easily. However, I have had customers that have federation turned on, so they don't have open federation. They have more of a closed federation scenario where they might have a list of domains listed in Teams that they're allowed to communicate with. In this scenario, company X and company Y both need to ensure that they are federated to one another and that that company X has company Y in their domain allow or their allow domain policy, and company Y has company X in their allow domain policy. And the last way is guesting. So if you don't want to turn on open federation and you don't want to turn on federation for the company or add the company X or company Y to your domain allow inside of federation, you can guest. And what guesting is for example, company X will guest company Y or the company Y user into their tenant. And this allows them to communicate with one another. I do want to note that you want company X to do the guesting. So I'm going to go back to the image. You want company X to do the guesting because Remote Assist currently cannot change domains. So inside of Teams, if you use Teams, on the top right-hand corner, there is a button that you can use to switch Teams tenants, as I'd like to call it. So right now I'm in Microsoft, but if I wanted to, I can go to Contoso and log in as Payge Winfield at Contoso. Remote Assist doesn't have that capability at the moment, so it's really important to note that you want company X to be the one that's guesting company Y into the tenant. So I'm going to go back here. And how do I share files and documents? So sharing files and documents is on by default. However, I want to note that when you are sharing files, it has to align with your SharePoint policies. So if you have strict SharePoint policies that does not allow you to exchange documents or share documents externally, that will block the sharing. So Remote Assist and Teams will honor whatever SharePoint policies you have set. So Remote Assist grants you the ability to share files internally as well as externally. If you are on Microsoft Teams, you will see a paperclip icon in your annotation bar, and the file will then appear in the Remote Assist user's physical space. And so I'm going to pause for a moment so that way I can allow questions for this section.
Yep, we have a couple questions that came in already. Okay. The first one is from Boris, and it says, is there a way to blur out content in an RA session?
Thanks, Boris. Thank you for the question. Right now, there is not a way to blur out content. I have had this request, and this is something that we're actively investigating. So let me give a scenario in which you might want to blur out content for other folks that are on the call. So in this scenario, you might have an instance where the Remote Assist is in an environment where there's PII, which is personal identifiable information. And you might not want the person who's on Teams or the external person who's on Teams to see that PII. So in order to, so one of the requests that we receive is to block out that or blur out that content where PII is. Currently, we don't have a feature for that, but that is something we are actively investigating, and hopefully we'll have some updates in the next couple of months.
Awesome, thank you. And then another one, this one is from Anonymous, and you may have answered it, but they said, how can I share Office documents such as Excel or PowerPoint?
Yeah, so inside of Teams or the Teams client user, they're able to click on the icon button, which is in the annotation bar, and that will pull up a document. To my understanding, I don't believe Excel is one of the documents that we support, but you can do PDF and Word documents, as well as like wiring diagrams. I've seen people pull up wiring diagrams. So there's quite a few different document types, and I think what I should do is I'll at the end of this call I'll link a a link to the Remote Assist page, which will talk a little bit more about documents.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
And then another one from Anonymous says, this one is a little bit longer, so if you need me to read it twice, just let me know.
Okay.
It says, for external HoloLens remote assist user scenario, company X can create a Teams meeting and company Y can join that meeting from desktop and company X can join from HoloLens. This is useful when federation is not possible. Is that right?
Okay, can you read it one more time?
Yes. For external HoloLens remote assist user scenario, company X can create a Teams meeting and company Y can join that meeting from the desktop and company X can join from the HoloLens. This is useful when federation is not possible. Is that right?
To my understanding, yes. So what federation does, it prevents you from searching. So that's one-on-one calls. So let me take a step back. So there's a couple ways that you can initiate conversations between company X and Y, or just between Remote Assist and Teams users in general. They can be inside the same company or outside the same company. The first way is calling them directly, where the client who's the Remote Assist user can call the expert or vice versa. When you do have two separate companies, like company X and Y, and federation is turned off, you aren't able to create or call or do those direct calls because federation disables that. But you're absolutely correct. When you have company X and Y and they create a meeting instead of doing a call, both companies can join the call and federation is not needed. So you are correct.
Wonderful, thank you.
You're welcome.
And then Rick S. asked, does the company-wide SharePoint policies need to also allow sharing files externally or just company X?
So you want both, because in my experience, it's usually company Y, the expert, is typically the one sharing the documents with company X. I haven't seen the scenario too often where the client and company X is sharing, is doing the document sharing. Typically, where you run into issues is when company X, company Y, who's external, is sharing the document. So it's important to really make sure that company Y is the one that has appropriate SharePoint permissions for whatever particular file or document that they're sharing.
Perfect. Then we have one more right now.
Okay.
This is from Scott, and they do say that this might be coming up. So it might be something you want to answer now, or maybe it's coming up later on in your presentation.
Okay.
But Scott asked, can company Y own the HoloLens, send it to company X for them to use, and then send it to company Z for them to use? How would you keep company Z from seeing company Y's information?
I'm glad you asked. So I will cover that in the next section because we have the servicing scenario, but I'll speak a little bit to it now. So if company Y owns the HoloLens and company X owns Remote Assist, technically you can share or send your HoloLens to company X. However, in my experience, many companies use MDM, a mobile device management system, and require that in order to, or let me take another step back. And in the scenario, I've seen customers where company X is the one that has MDM turned on, and they're managing devices, and they have a policy that you can't access certain credentials unless you're logged on to a device that's being managed by them. So if company Y sends company X a device, company X might have a policy in place where the client can't log into Remote Assist on company Y's device because it's not enrolled in company X, or it's not managed by company X. So you can't get into some scenarios, some issues with like that. So we typically don't recommend company Y sending company X a device when company X has Remote Assist or owns the Remote Assist license. What we typically see, and I'm going to go on to the next slide, is something like this, where company Y owns the device and owns remote assist, and it sends company X the device that already has remote assist enabled on it. So how do we restrict what if company X can communicate with company Z? And typically we see that with one, the chat history is always deleted, so company X and company Z can't see the chat history from can't see the chat history. And then also, what we also see is that you typically need, so one, HoloLens to HoloLens communication isn't enabled. So you might have company X using a HoloLens and company Z using a HoloLens, and they wouldn't be able to communicate using remote assist because that just isn't supported by the remote assist app. And can you read the question one more time? Because I really want to make sure I answer it fully.
Yeah, definitely. Can company Y own the HoloLens, send it to company X for them to use, and then send it to company Z for them to use? How would you keep company Z from seeing company Y's information?
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the second part of that, how do you make sure that company X and Z don't see each other's information? And you would do that by one, remote assist automatically deletes the chat after each session. And then two, I highly recommend enabling WDAC, which is the policy I talked about a little bit before, and I'll talk about it again towards the end. But that security policy that prevents, it's like it puts apps on a block or allow list, so prevents the user from accessing certain apps. And the app that I suggest blocking is the web browser, which is Explorer on the HoloLens. And the reason, or Edge, I'm sorry, the Edge browser. Explorer is a little older. So the Edge browser on the HoloLens. And the reason I say that is because they're single sign-on. And because they're single sign-on, and even though the chat history is deleted from the remote assist perspective, it's still stored in Teams. So the expert in company Y will have chat history. Company X and company Z will not have chat history, but I highly recommend turning on WDAC, disabling the Edge browser because of single sign-on, and you don't want to accidentally have someone sign onto the Teams web version and see the chat history. So I highly recommend turning on WDAC. Okay, so I'm going to pause and or take a step back and talk a little bit more about this slide. So in this scenario, company Y has the experts, who have Teams licenses. They also own the remote assist license, as well as the HoloLens. And company X might be a vendor, might be a client, and might be a subdivision of company Y, but they're on two separate tenants. What we have here is the client logging into a service account, which is a generic name or generic account. I've seen both of these terms be used. So if you see generic account or service account, just imagine them being used interchangeably, which is basically how it sounds, a generic account that you can distribute to other people. And this generic account has the remote assist license assigned to it. What happens is company X or the client 2 inside of company X will log into the service account and then use the remote assist app and communicate with the Teams expert. And this is something that's growing more, so that's why it's listed as the number 3. At first I didn't see it as often as I saw scenarios 1 and 2, but now I'm seeing this more and more often where this servicing, providing remote assistant HoloLens as a service scenario pop up. And it's super important to note that the service account can either be a 1 ratio where only client 2 can log into that service account, or a 1-to-many ratio or scenario where client 1 and client 2 can use that service account. However, company Y wants to set that up. But with that being said, I want to touch on some of the common concerns that I see with this scenario. Going back to a similar question that we've seen in slide in the first scenario is, how do I restrict the HoloLens to only display or allow certain apps? And again, the answer is going to be that kiosk mode in WDAC. Again, kiosk mode is a user experience, excuse me, a user experience modification or a user experience feature, where WDAC is a security feature to add apps on the allow or block list. How do I manage passwords? So in this scenario, a lot of the times I see customers sending it to more than one company. So they'll own the HoloLens and the Remote Assist app. They might send it to company X, and then they'll get it back, and then they'll send it to company Z, and then they'll get it back and send it to another company. And with that being said, it is important to note that the NIST standard for password rotation is anywhere between 30 and 90 days. So you want to make sure that you're resetting those passwords. You can extend it. I've seen customers who, will send a device to a site for long-term usage, and the long-term use might be 365 days for a whole year. You can extend it, but you have to also recognize that there's a certain level of risk that you might ensue by, extending the passwords for more than 90 days, the password management rotation process for more than 90 days. I also want to note that when these devices are going out, the clients in this situation don't have the actual passwords. So one recommendation that I typically tell customers to do is to, one, set up the HoloLens device inside of their own tenant. So company Y, and I'll go back to the slide. Company Y will set up the HoloLens. They will log into it for the first time. They will set up a PIN. So HoloLens 2 uses Windows Hello. So what the PIN does is the password is encrypted and stored locally on the HoloLens device. And then whenever you use the PIN, which is what you would provide to the client, that will decrypt the password. So highly recommend not sharing passwords, sharing PINs instead. And this is also just for a broader security reason. You don't want to have the user having access to passwords, because then they'll have access to the full account. You just want them to have access to the account when they're on that specific device, which is the HoloLens. And that is why the PIN is strongly recommended. And then the last question, or that I typically get, is how to ensure that clients do not have access to the chat history. This goes back to that question that I just went over from the anonymous. And again, the Remote Assist deletes the chat history after every use, and I highly recommend turning on WDAC to block the Edge browser. Okay, I feel like I said a lot, so I'm going to pause and allow for some questions.
All right, we do have a couple questions. So the first one is asking if you are going to cover one-time RA sessions. And then it follows that with, if you turn off the browser, you can't log into captive networks, e.g. sites that require a browser-based login for access to their network.
Okay, thank you. And yes, that is correct. So if you have a scenario where you have like company X or company Z, who are the clients and who are receiving the HoloLens and the Remote Assist or Remote Assist app, and they need to access like a guest network or a captive portal, yes, you will need the browser. So then you shouldn't turn it off. And in that case, you probably don't want to have shared or use a shared account or generic account. Instead, you might want a 1-to-1 ratio where and let me actually go back to the slide so that way I can talk to the image. So instead of having client 1 and 2 both share that service account, you might want to create separate accounts for those individual clients. Or you might have one account for company X all up, where you might have, and I'm not sure how many users are in the contract for shared accounts. I'm not sure if it's 2 users or 10 users that can use the same account. So I want to give that caveat, but you can have a company X service account where you have client 1, 2 to N using that same account, and then company Z has a different account. And that's another way to just make sure that they don't see each other's chat history by using the browser. So that's one workaround. But yes, if you do need the browser, then of course don't turn on WDAC. But you might want to think about how you want to distribute these service accounts. And potentially, and my recommendation is to have a different service account for either each individual user or each individual company.
Perfect. And that one the answer you just gave might sort of answer this next question, but the question came in is, don't shared accounts pose significant security risks? IT departments typically frown on them.
Yes, so there are some risks with shared accounts. With Remote Assist, of course, you wouldn't be able to know exactly who's logging in on the HoloLens at what time. So for instance, you have me, Paige, and then you might have Bob and Sue. And if we're all using the same shared account, you don't necessarily know who's logging in at a particular point in time. And with that being said, that's when you would probably want to do a 1-to-1 ratio where Bob has his own account, Sue has her own account, and I have my own account. However, I have seen many customers use the shared account model because they lock down the device. So they turn on Kiosk mode, they turn on WDAC. They might not turn on, some customers have the browser enabled, other customers don't. But they turned on these policies to make sure that the only thing that the customers can access is, for example, Remote Assist or Remote Assistant guides. And there are multiple customers that are using this scenario, but again, they had their security teams involved. We went through the risk, did a risk assessment, and they decided that the risk was something that they were comfortable with. And to be, not every company might be comfortable with that risk. So to mitigate that, instead of doing a shared account, you might just want to do an individual account instead. But the shared accounts have a certain type of license. The reason that people want to use shared account is because it's cheaper. Because you have one license for, like, example, you might have 10 users using the same license, and that's cheaper than having 10 licenses for 10 users. But the trade-off is you do lose some of that individuality with knowing who's logging in at what time.
Perfect. That looks like all the questions for now. I think we can move on to the next section.
Okay. Okay, so deployment steps. And this is the last main slide, and then the next slide is just going to have some links. But with the deployment steps, we have, first, you have your identity. And so HoloLens is an active, you need to enroll the HoloLens in Azure Active Directory, also known as Azure AD. It does not currently support Active Directory. So it's really important to make sure that you are enrolling your devices into Azure Active Directory, so that way you can then manage them, manage the accounts. With that being said, there's two ways you can do that. You can do auto enrollment, which a lot of people use. They log into the device, they put in their credentials, which is usually their email and their username, and that automatically enrolls the device into Azure AD. There's also Autopilot, which I believe is in preview. I'll put a link in the chat because Autopilot is a whole another conversation that we probably don't have time for. But Autopilot is something that we also recommend, or something that we're starting to recommend customers use. And again, I will link something in the chat, and it's also going to be linked in the next slide. The second one is mobile device management. So you want to make sure that the HoloLens is enrolled in your MDM, and it supports most MDMs, or most MDMs support HoloLens, excuse me. And some things that I typically recommend customers do is to, one, create Wi-Fi profiles, if necessary. Not everyone needs Wi-Fi profiles, but if you do have a Wi-Fi network that has particular settings, you might want to create Wi-Fi profiles and certificates and push those down to the device. There's also something new that came out, which is tenant locking. And tenant locking the device, I love this feature. It's good for asset management. So number one, when you enroll the HoloLens into your MDM, so let's say you roll it into Contoso, or even better, Company X, since we've been using that, you enroll the device into Company X. What tenant locking does is makes it so that even if the HoloLens is wiped and put to factory reset, Let's just say there's a bad actor out there who wants to steal HoloLenses, and they take the HoloLens from company X. They do a factory flash or a factory reset on the device, and then they try to enroll it in company Y. In this scenario, company Y is the bad actor. What tenant locking does is it prevents that device from being able to enroll into company Y. So company Y won't be able to functionally use the HoloLens because they can't enroll it even after a factory reset. So that's the really cool thing about tenant locking. Again, in the next slide, there's a lot of links. They're going to have some deployment guides, and tenant locking is mentioned in those deployment guides. So definitely suggest checking that out. Another thing that another policy that I usually have customers push down is to manage their updates with update/allow auto update. And this is a CSP, a configuration service provider. And there's a long list. We have so many CSPs for HoloLenses. But what this one particularly does is just allows the HoloLens to automatically update, which we suggest due to when we push security fixes and patches, you want to make sure that you're up to date and that you're getting those as soon as possible. I have had customers who want to roll out the update on a particular subset of devices to make sure it doesn't break anything before rolling it out to all of the devices, and that is an option as well. So there's multiple ways that you can manage rolling out updates. And one notable thing to note here about MDM and Azure AD is that in Azure AD, you can put users in groups, and you can push these policies to groups. So you might have the remote assist group where you have a certain set of policies you want to push to the remote assist group or the users who are part of that group. And then you might also have a guides group, for example, D365 guides, where you might have a particular set of policies or profiles that you want to send to that group. So that's something to keep in mind is when you're targeting profiles or targeting users or user groups for these profiles, that you can have user groups. Some customers target individual users, but if you have users that are under the same umbrella, you can put them in a group and target them that way. And then the last thing is restricting the device. Again, talked about this a few times, so I'll be very brief. You have kiosk mode and WDAC. Kiosk mode, I want to go a little bit deeper because I didn't go too deep in, but there's two types of kiosk mode. There's single app and multi-app kiosk mode. I typically recommend customers use multi-app kiosk mode because with multi-app, you're able to target particular AAD users or AAD groups, and that's Azure AD. Azure AD users or Azure AD groups. And you can still just put one single app in multi-app kiosk mode, which is really nice. But targeting AAD users and groups isn't a capability currently for single mode kiosk or single app kiosk mode. So I typically just recommend doing multi-app kiosk mode and targeting a particular AAD group or user. And then WDAC, again, is more so a security feature to block or allow apps. Okay, so I'm going to pause once again and open it up for a couple questions before I move on to the next slide.
Perfect, and we do have some questions.
Okay.
So the first one is, how long does it typically take to roll out remote assist in an organization? Are there major prerequisites our IT team needs to prepare for if we are new to the mixed reality space?
Yeah. Great question. Thank you. So I've rolled out Azure AD in like a test tenant where I spun a tenant up. I went to Microsoft and got like a M365 license and spun up a tenant. So it spun up Azure AD as well as Intune. And usually it's a pretty easy process. The only thing that you really need to make sure that you have is Azure AD and that whoever you want remote assist to or whoever you want to use remote assist has Azure AD identities. You also want to make sure that you have your remote assist license, which will show up once you purchase it. It will show up in Azure AD. It also shows up in your Office 365 portal, but I personally like working in Azure AD, so I do most of my work there. But it shows up in both places. So you want to make sure you have an Azure AD identity, that you assign your remote assist license to that Azure AD and Azure AD identity. You also would need to enroll the device into Azure AD, and that the enrollment process typically only takes like 5 to 10 minutes. We have Ubi, which is our out-of-box experience. So when you first open up the HoloLens, they have you do some eye calibration. They have you log in. They have you set a PIN. Then when you're setting a PIN, it's MFA, so you have to put a cell phone number, and then that will, you'll type in a code, and then you'll be able to use your HoloLens, and it'll enroll into Azure AD. And then from there, you want to also make sure that the Remote Assist app is updated. You can do that by going to the Windows Store, going to Remote Assist, and then hitting the update button. And then after that, you could use it. I also want to note that it's also going to depend on your network. So if you do have certificates that you need to be pushed down, we highly suggest using device-based certificates. It gets a little wonky with user-based certificates. So we usually recommend that customers, to save them time, energy, and frustration, to use device-based certificates. So when you enroll the device into Azure AD, those MDM policies are going to start being pushed down automatically. So to answer your question, it's going to depend. I've seen customers get this up and going in a matter of a day, or I've seen other customers struggle a little bit, especially if they have some complex networking or like a complex infrastructure. And usually where I see customers get a little bit caught up is in the certificate space. So it's really important to make sure that, one, you're using device-based certificates, that you make sure that your MDM supports device-based certificates as well, and that you have those profiles set up and targeted to those remote assist users, so that way they can receive those device-based certificates. But yeah, I hate answering a question with the answer "it depends," but this is one of those scenarios where it's going to depend on how complex your infrastructure is.
Makes sense. Thank you. Next question is from Simon, and Simon asks, are there plans to use a QR code style zero-touch enrollment?
Hi, thanks, Simon. Not to my knowledge. Right. Oh, wait, actually, with Autopilot, I think there is. Let me actually just pull up some Autopilots, and I'll drop the link in the in the chat. I do not believe there are plans, if it's not already included in Autopilot. I haven't had that experience where it's included in Autopilot. No, I don't think it is. But to my knowledge, not at the moment. But I'm happy to send updates as they come. Out of curiosity, are these slides going to be posted live?
Yes, we will be able to post them with the recording on YouTube.
Okay, perfect. I will do a little bit digging, and I'll just update the slide if there is a way, if we do have QR code on our roadmap. Perfect,
thank you.
You're welcome.
And then next question, does the device need to be enrolled in MDM to enforce auto update? Is there some way to do it without MDM?
So yes. This update / allow auto update is a CSP, which is a configuration service provider, which gets pushed down to the device through MDM. There's a way that you can update the device. You can go to the settings tab and click updates, and then I believe by default it it will tell you if there's an update, or it will give updates. But in my experience, the best way to manage these devices is with MDM. You just have much more granular control. As well as with the updates, you can set updates times, because one thing that customers ran into in the past, especially with HoloLens ones, were they would, they'll pick up the device, put it on, and get ready for a call, and then they have to wait for an update, which is super inconvenient. So I definitely recommend using MDM to manage the devices, and it's also good for storage perspective or asset management. MDM, when you enroll these devices into MDM, you're able to kind of track. You're able to see timestamps as to where it was last, or when it was last logged into. You're able to see who's logged into the device. The device has a device owner. You can do things like tenant lock, which will prevent the device from being stolen and enrolled into someone else's tenant. I definitely recommend use MDM for security purposes, for asset management tracking purposes, and for updating.
Great. It looks like that is all the questions for right now.
Oh, okay. So the last slide, well, my last slide was just links. I should, but these are some links if you wanted to learn more about deployment. These are some of our deployment guides that we have published. I highly recommend taking a look at these. They have a lot of great content. They also link off to other documents that if you want to read more about, like for instance, shared accounts, or you want to read more about remote assist in general. They also link to the remote assist documents. I just highly recommend taking a look at these. And then that was it. That was the presentation. So if there are any other questions, I'm happy to take a pause to answer them.
Yeah, we can give it a few minutes and we'll leave the link up there. That way if folks want to or have a chance to write that down so they can go and visit that site. Like I mentioned, we will include the slides in the description of the YouTube recording, and I will share that link in the chat again, so you don't have to scroll through to find it, where you'll be able to find this session recorded and the slides. And usually we get that up on the channel in about 48 hours. So look for it on Friday, probably. And we can give it a few more seconds while I get that in there to see if we have any more questions. All right, it looks like we have no more questions at this time. Thank you all again for joining us today. It was great to have you here for this event. Hopefully we'll be doing some more with Payge in the future. This was awesome. Payge, anything else before we go?
No, just super excited. Thank you for having me come to speak. And I just look forward to hopefully doing some more events in the future. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day or evening.